Greetings all! In this episode, we'll be painting Skaven Clanrats for Games Workshop's Warhammer Age of Sigmar tabletop wargame. This is the first of 4 episodes exploring the faction and their Gnaw-Feast Clawpack Spearhead. Today we'll be focusing on color palettes for 3 materials: Skaven Skin with Rudy Fur, basic blue fabric, and basic green fabric. Future episodes will cover other materials appearing on the model, such as wood and corroded dark bronze. We'll be using exclusively Army Painter paints in this video to ensure accessibility should you wish to replicate what you see here. The full list of paints used are on screen now. Today's tale marks the start of part 2 of the ongoing narrative, A Red Harvest, which explores the conflict between the goblin forces of Big Boss Nitbit da Sneaky and the endless swarm of their ratkin enemy, ruled over by the Rat King himself, Lord Chagits. If you have not yet watched the preceding videos in this narrative and are disinclined to do so, a short primer video is available should you wish for more context. I hope you enjoy the video and the accompanying tale. This story contains violence, death, and claustrophobic situations. Viewer discretion is advised. Scratch and Dabs inched their way forward, Scratch jabbing into every dark corner with her spear, while Dabs eyed the walls before, behind, and above them. A tumult of shouts and screams echoed about, dulling the closer sounds that would betray the presence of the gangly ratties. When the initial wave of ratkin flowed down the tunnels, the frontline units were immediately overrun, the cacophony of the living tide drowning out even Quib's manic pounding of his clangor. Despite the narrow juncture Taglets had stationed them at, the surge of so many flailing bodies would not be denied, and their unit was forced to fall back to secondary positions. This first wave of frenzied ratties were, however, so cripplingly frail and the crush of bodies so dense that any firm, unfocused sweep of a blade would fell 3 or 4 of them. By the time they'd reached the next layer of defenses, a literal wall of corpses had formed, choking off the tunnel. Unfortunately for Scratch and Dabs, the struggle had pushed them in the wrong direction, and they were now cut off from the rest of their forces. Fortunately for Scratch and Dabs, this was neither their first march, nor their first time stuck behind enemy lines. So began the long, laborious process of clearing every hollow, nook, and crag they passed, while using the effigy and its soft pulsing in their brains to slowly arc back towards their own lines. Dabs whistled low and short, stopping Scratch in her tracks. He gave a curt nod of his head back in the direction they had come, which she returned before turning her attention once more to the space before them. Dabs backtracked a few paces, darted his gaze about, and knelt next to what caught his eye. He brought back the small, blood-spattered totem and showed it to Scratch. She nodded again. A goblin had passed through here, and not willingly. That meant more than a few ratties who now likely had the strength to put up a proper fight. The 2 gobs reduced their pace even further, slowing their breathing as well and forcing their muscles to relax. A few moments later, Scratch stopped and set her spear as she caught the glittering of sickly yellow eyes in the shadows before her. A piercing shriek struck their ears, and a flurry of raging teeth leapt from the hollow which Scratch swiftly impaled on her spear. She tried to pull it free from the flailing creature, but it stuck fast, caught on a rib and a grasping hand. Neither Scratch nor Dabs fell for the ruse. Dab's eyes were already on the upper walls as Scratch thrust the spear and the dying ratty away and reached for her own paired stabas. A chorus of cries and howls erupted above them. The dark walls, silhouetted against the dim, clouded early morning light, began to boil towards them. The goblins gripped their blades and roared their own shouts of defiance. The hopper landed at an awkward angle, one foot planted on solid ground, the other on the back of a squirming ratty. The descending weight of the muscly mass crushed the air out of the creature with a sudden wheezing squeak. A moment later the hopper exploded upwards again, this time with a ratkin clamped firmly in its massive gob. Or most of one. At the apogee of its arcing flight, it spat out the remnant in anticipation of another catch. Wild hoppers, it seemed, were none too fond of ratties, enjoying the chase but disdaining the meal. It would have been a fascinating piece of insight were Glicky in any position to consider this singularly discerning taste. As it were, he was having a hard enough time keeping the simple mantra of "hold on, hold on, hold on" from being rocked out of his brain. Neither he nor Pillock had any idea what would happen when the rotund orange balls of teeth were let loose on the ratties, free to leap and bound without the guiding prods of a herder. What happened, of course, was the only thing that could have happened. Complete mayhem. Remarkably effective mayhem. Pillock had promised to keep them above the ratties before them and the ravaging hoppers behind them, and above them both they were kept. The first sudden appearance of vicious cavalry in the gorge's narrow confines halted the mass of slavering ratkin as they regained, for a moment, a sense of their own mortality, scattering them as best as they could be scattered. It didn't take long, however, before the beast's tactical limitations became clear. While low ceilings weren't much of a threat to hoppers themselves, they were very much so to their riders, who risked being turned into a sticky paste. It was also all well and good to bound over snarling heads and cruel weapons, but you still had to come down, and hopper cavalry was not impervious. Poor Slex was torn apart when his hopper stood too long after landing, while Carabina had lost her grip and been catapulted far off into the ranks of ratkins with a dying shriek. Glicky, between skirmishes when the ratties had all been mashed into heaps, chewed to pieces, or turned and fled, had wagered with his boss as to the best use of the surly creatures. They had yet to come up with anything more functional than to point a hopper in the general direction they wanted to go, hold on tight, and hope for the best. Which, so far, had generally worked out perfectly. On the next bounce, which very nearly tossed Glicky this time, the hopper did something entirely unexpected. It pulsed a brilliant green color and, while soaring upwards, began to deflate with a long, gurgling sound. Glicky found himself gripping onto a shriveled bag of blackened orange skin and bones when he hit the ground, and a bunch of ratties, with a splintering crunch. Otherwise unharmed, he stood and looked about in stunned alarm. Another blast of harsh green light drew his eye, and he saw it. It was a ratty, but not like any he'd seen before. This one was tall, with white fur and a pair of great big curving horns. In one hand it held a tall staff whose ornate top made Glicky's head hurt to look at. Its other hand was pointed at the goblin, a green glow dying on the tips of his clawed fingers. Strangely, though the source of the light was burning out, the green light itself didn't fade from Glicky's vision. Instead, his sight was consumed by the brilliant color. Half blind, Glicky took a step forward, and heard the unsettling sound of his own bones splintering and crumbling. They were everywhere, covering the floor, climbing the walls, dangling from the ceiling, hanging from Thort himself. Every lumbering step the troll took was accompanied with high-pitched cries that hurt its ears as one of the furry creatures was crushed beneath its tread. At first, the troll didn't mind so much. The squirming tickle between its toes was a fun sensation. But the novelty soon wore off, and it missed the dependable firmness of solid rock under the soles of its feet. Thort was also tired of the creatures themselves. They were prickly things, constantly biting the troll with their tiny teeth, claws, and bits of metal. They couldn't hurt it, of course. Even the biggest it had yet seen could scarcely break the tough skin. When they did, it was the shallowest nick that healed before they could cut it again. It was like being itchy everywhere all at once, where no amount of scratching helped. The things weren't even good eating either. The tiniest, disappointing crunch, like twigs in a sack, followed by a horrid aftertaste. By the third or fourth one, Thort concluded they were wholly inedible. The troll brushed a craggy hand down a craggy arm, wiping off a trio of the noisome things for a moment of relief, then swept its mighty club in a wide, low arc. A wave of shattering bones and screams rose up, much to Thort's grim satisfaction. Trolls were not by nature an ill-tempered breed, but even the most dull-witted, pleasure-loving beings have their limits. Both Trude and Tunk were well past theirs. Thort peered about the wide, dimly lit hall and spied its friends in the distance. Where Thort was still actively trying not to squish any of the green things scampering about, the other two trolls had no compunction. They had all been promised more of the tasty green rocks that tickled them with delight. Down this way, the creatures pointed. Just past the next turn, they promised. Only a bit further, they gestured with assurance. But despite all their roaming, Thort, Trude, and Tunk never found any green specials. Just more biting, foul-tasting creatures. Ow! Quick as lightning, Thort slammed its free hand against the side of its face, pulping the critter that had nearly stabbed it in the eye. Now that had hurt. This was perhaps the worst part of it all, not being able to sit still or even stand unaccosted for a few minutes, let alone hours. Trolls are ponderous beings which lived a ponderous life. Too much stimulation for too long a span and they started to go rabid. Once that happens, trolls cease to be powerful, if blunt, weapons and quickly become very dangerous liabilities. Thort's weak vision caught a glimmer in the tunnel ahead of it. A shimmer of bright, unmistakable, off-putting green. Its small eyes widened. The troll raised its arm and pointed towards the tunnel with the head of its massive weapon. Oh! Recognition. Specials! He bellowed with such violent joy that the smaller creatures around him, green ones and furry ones alike, dropped their weapons and clamped hands to their ears. Trude and Tunk swung their massive heads toward Thort, following the pointing club. And so there were. Pinpricks of green light set in the darkness like stars of an ugly hue in a bruised night sky. Stars that twinkled and danced. Or? Confusion. Green specials didn't dance. At least, the few Thort had seen hadn't. A choir of ululating howls burst from the tunnel as the things emerged. Thort didn't register their shape. Its brain didn't acknowledge that each was nearly the same size as a troll. There was only room for a single thought in its tiny brain. It was the same one that gripped the other two trolls. The three lumbering friends spared each other quick, toothsome grins before issuing great cries of excitement and charging with alarming alacrity towards the new arrivals, weapons raised high, the scampering creatures at their feet entirely forgotten. Where the goblins saw monsters, twisted abominations, horrifying misshapen grotesqueries of ratkin experimentation that would blast their sanity if they stared at them too long, the trolls had eyes for only one thing: the giant chunks of weirdstone embedded in the hides of the beasts themselves. Sticklet clenched his toes so they wouldn't scrape the ground. He held his breath so it wouldn't rustle the air. He even closed his eyes so the sound of his blinking wouldn't give him away. He was holed up, tucked in the hollow of the tiniest crack he could crawl into. He had lost his stabba and had only the crude, rusty blade of a ratty he'd scavenged. This he held in front of his face, pointed at the opening. The opening, small as it was far too close. The goblin would have shimmied further back if he could without getting his head stuck. It was just Sticklet now. The rest had been... well, they weren't around anymore. Sticklet, like the rest of the younger goblins, had never actually seen a ratty before the march. He'd seen the spy the older gobs had caught and, at the time, hadn't been impressed. It was a fetid thing of broken teeth and claws with vanishingly thin arms and missing patches of fur. If this was the enemy, Sticklet grimly recalled thinking, then the gobs couldn't possibly lose. His lack of caution, as well as those of his unit, were their undoing. For the ratkins, Sticklets quickly learned, were much like bitey bugs. One or two were easy enough to squish underfoot, and even a dozen could be managed if you were careful and had a long pokey stick. But if you got surrounded by a bunch of them with nothing more than a stabba to fend them off, that was another matter. Fall into a nest and you might as well take the quick way out rather than being bitten to death. Fighting ratties was like charging into one nest of bitey bugs after another, day in, day out, until you'd squished them all or got yourself eaten. Memories of the flagger and his fate shivered through Sticklets' small frame, and he tried quietly stretching his legs further down the tunnel. Not that it would help if they found him. The scurrying sounds of furry, grimy feet and the chittering of ugly voices at the crack's opening finally dimmed and disappeared. Sticklet took a shallow breath in relief and considered whether it was safe enough yet to crawl out. The breath caught when something tickled by his foot. Terror froze even his heart, stopping it for a full beat. Then there came a hard yank, and Sticklet was pulled back a few inches. He would have been pulled back further but for his head. He stifled a pained shriek as it caught, jammed firmly between the rock wall and his arm. He bit down again against the pain as he was yanked again. He had to stay quiet after all, so they wouldn't find him. There came a pause, and whatever had grabbed him let go. Sticklet dared not yet dream of relief. A moment later, he started to scream. Unable to dislodge the goblin, whatever had found Sticklet decided at last to simply enjoy its meal where it had stuck fast.
I don't think it'll work. It'll work. But what about that there grey one? He looks awfully sneaky. It'll work. He does, doesn't he? Sneaky enough to figure it out, maybe. That's right. And what if he does? Won't matter. Won't it? No. Why not? 'Cause it can't matter, that's why. I still don't think it'll work. Good thing you ain't the sorry god that's got to go do it then, eh? Yeah. It was your idea after all. And he that thinks it up gets to have all the fun in doing it. Yep. Mind ya, I don't think it'll be all that fun baiting the big guy. Nope. Well then. Yeah. Well then. I'll help you get ready, Nitbit. Thanks, Nitbit.
That was the Scabrous Horde, the first episode in A Red Harvest Part 2, War Battle for Broken Lands. I hope you enjoyed the tale. So I ended up spending a heck of a lot more time painting these clanrats than I had originally intended, which is usually the case. I hadn't accounted for the variety of materials or appreciated the level of complexity required for the various skin tones. On the plus side though, I accidentally figured out a great recipe for wood. I've most of the base coating done for the second unit of 10 clanrats and should have them all completed by the next episode in this series. For the remaining 20 models in the Skaven Tide box, I'll be flipping the blue and green materials, green on the bottom and blue on top, to more easily differentiate units on the tabletop while maintaining the same color scheme. Once all 40 are all done, I'll go back and figure out what designs to paint on all the banners. I'm using these Skaven to test out a modular system for swappable bases, allowing me to not only use the models for both Age of Sigmar and Old World, but to ensure that they'll always be usable in the future if base sizes ever change. The system is still a work in progress, and I'll be releasing a video on it once I've figured it out. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions, questions, or feedback on anything else you've seen in this video, please comment below. If you'd like to read today's story, a text-only version is available on Archive of Our Own, link in the video description below. That's it for today. See you next time.